This is Dr. Mary Engels. She is a professor in the Department of Natural Resources and Society at the University of Idaho. She is an interdisciplinary scientist with considerable experience in ecology, climate science, and marine biology. She also shares my passion for environmental education and natural resources conservation. She was kind enough to agree to participate in this interview about insular biogeography theory.
So actually this for me really started as an undergrad. I had the opportunity to study abroad in Costa Rica as an undergrad. And at the time, I fully thought I was going to medical school, going on a different track, and I was like, last hurrah, I will maybe study coral reefs. And in the process of that study abroad, I got really interested in reefs and reef ecosystems, and it really changed the direction that I was planning to go after undergrad. And so I moved to Hawaii after graduation and started a master's program there, looking at coral reefs, actually off the island of Molokai was where my field site was. And that really got me sort of interested in just the dynamics of islands. The reefs in Hawaii are super isolated, and so there are far fewer species of corals than in some of the more well-known Indonesian hotspots. But because of their isolation, the different species have taken all these different forms. There's a lot of species plasticity because there's all these available niches. And so they evolve into occupying these different niches. And so that really got me interested in just sort of the dynamics of islands and island biogeography and how interesting it is. Island biogeography as a science really evolved from oceanic islands. Alfred Russel Wallace, he did a lot of his field work on islands. That's how he really came to think about these ideas. And so oceanographic islands are these really good laboratories for island biogeography. But what people realized as they started studying these ecosystems is that the same parameters apply not just in oceanic settings, where there's the obvious barrier of water, but that there are plenty of examples on land where there are barriers, geographic barriers, that create these insular ecosystems. And so the idea of island biogeography, they sometimes refer to it as terrestrial island biogeography. And mountains and mountaintops in particular are these really excellent examples of terrestrial islands. Insular biogeography, the important feature is that there is a rapid gradient between the ecosystem of one type and an ecosystem of another, and that gradient is what is controlling the insular nature of that ecosystem. So when you're thinking about islands, right, like one of the sort of interesting characteristics of islands is that they tend to have a lot of diversity. Yeah. And the reason for that diversity goes back to the sort of insular nature of these different ecosystems. And so how organisms emigrate into these ecosystems and the rate at which they go extinct from these ecosystems controls sort of the population of organisms in that ecosystem. And time is a huge factor. Time and the difficulty of basically getting into that ecosystem. So in an island setting, it's relatively easy to imagine, right? Like you've got an island that's off the coast somewhere, and there's a geographic barrier of water, right? And so anything that doesn't do well in water is unlikely to easily access that island. And so that vector of transport, unless there's some, say a hurricane, for example. Hurricanes are great vectors for transporting organisms. So if there are organisms that have been transported by a hurricane and end up on an island, they may be the only organism of that species there for quite a long time. And as I was talking about before, right, when there's all these available niches, there's all this opportunity for these organisms to diversify. And so in that kind of situation, you may have what's known as sympatric speciation, where you have organisms that are working on occupying different niches. And so maybe you have a species that has decided to occupy the trees, and maybe you have, where they started out as the same parental organism, you have an organism that is then occupying the ground space. But over time, that environmental barrier or ecosystem barrier may become enough of a barrier that those organisms become truly different species. Whereas, you also have then the organism that gets to the island that is isolated from the mainland population, and they are also continuing to evolve, and so they may also evolve into different species. So that is allopatric speciation, where you have allo meaning just different, and so whereas sympatric means the same. They're in the same location versus different locations, and so you get speciation that occurs in those ways in these different island settings. So thinking about how different environmental variables come into play in terms of what species are developed. I mean, if you have, a lot of it goes back to niches and habitats. If you think about something like the Hawaiian Islands, right? Like, they're these volcanic edifices that stick up above the sea, and they have an enormous number of microclimates. And because of that, you end up with these really sort of unique little habitats. So on the island of Oahu, which is where I lived and worked for a while, right, like you have conditions that are very analogous to the desert Southwest. And at the same time, you have rainforests that are, a couple kilometers away. And so the organisms that arrive in the Hawaiian Islands, right, like there is such this diversity of habitat within this same insular ecosystem, the larger insular ecosystem being the island itself, but within that then there's also these terrestrial insular ecosystems as well. And so you get a lot of speciation that occurs because of this diversity of niches. So the environmental variables that come into play are all sort of the abiotic environmental variables that we'd consider. The temperature and rainfall and wind exposure and all of these different factors come into play in creating these microhabitats, and that really drives a lot of the speciation that occurs. So island ecosystems are really interesting because the threat is not equally distributed among all the species on the island. It depends a little bit on the adaptability of certain species. So the same barriers that limit the number of species that actually get to an island are a limiting factor in organisms adapting to disturbance, be that human-induced land use change or climate change, whatever these disturbances to their ecosystem are. Having a place to go is a problem if you're in an insular ecosystem. And there's two sort of different ways that things can go, right? Like if you're talking about climate change, maybe you're changing the environmental conditions that we just talked about to something that's beyond the tolerance of the organisms that have evolved there under a different climate. And if there is no analogous nearby insular ecosystem within that island system, then there isn't any place for those organisms to go unless they happen to have some way to get across a geographic barrier. And so that is really problematic, particularly in mountain systems. There, for a while, they may be able to use elevation in order to adapt, right? Like there's organisms that are moving upwards in elevation to maintain their ideal environmental conditions. But at some point you get to the top of the mountain, and then at that point there is nowhere else for them to go. And now at that point, the distance between that insular ecosystem and the next insular ecosystem that is appropriate for them has gotten that much larger. So that is really problematic. So I've got a graduate student who is out at Taylor Ranch doing some work looking at spring ecosystems. And part of the reason that we're really interested in these spring ecosystems is the idea of ecological refugia. Small insular ecosystems that may serve as stepping stones for endemic species or threatened species. And springs in particular are really interesting because, right, their source of water is not this season's precipitation derived. It is over a much longer period of time. So they may maintain the conditions that organisms can use to hop between different ecosystems. So that's what we're trying to understand, is that, like, how long those systems might be around and what that means in the face of this changing climate. I think that there are strategies for that. These buffer zones, kind of like the springs I was talking about, are in a way sort of this assisted migration. But the scale of those kinds of efforts to preserve these species for human-assisted migration to these different places is really enormous. And it brings up some interesting questions. So when you have really low population densities, there's something known as the allele effect that comes into play. When you have low population density, organisms need a certain number, depends on the organism, but you need a certain number of those species in order to actually survive. So it's not pure ability of the organisms to reproduce, it's also their habits. And there's been a lot of work showing how you need sort of a critical mass of organisms in order to have them thrive. So not just survive, but thrive in a particular environment. And that allele effect, depending on the organism, can be really important. And so if we are going to do something like assisted migration, we really have to pay attention to, is there an allele effect that's going to come into play with these organisms that we're moving? Because we might not be able to just move a few critical pairs. We might have to do large-scale population migration. For my PhD work, I spent some time studying Pisonia grandis, which is a native tree species. It's native to atoll islands. The common name of this tree is known as the bird killer tree. So the bird killer tree, or Pisonia grandis, so it's a fascinating tree, but it's called the bird killer tree because it has developed these very sticky seeds. And so the way that it spreads its seeds is through zoochory. So the seeds will stick to the seabirds, and then the seabirds will transport it to other locations. But the thing is, the trees are loved by birds for nesting. So there are many seabirds that use these trees as their main nesting sites. And it's wild to wander around in the forest. It's like this cacophony of birds in the trees when you get into a Pisonia forest. But at the same time, right, there are definitely examples of there being so many sticky seeds on the birds that they can no longer fly. That's why they're sometimes called bird killer trees. And so the birds starve because they can't actually get out to the ocean to eat. So it's this interesting coevolution. Trees provide roosting and nesting habitat for the birds, and then the birds in turn spread the seeds of this tree to more suitable habitat. The other cool thing about this tree, the bird guano that is dropped underneath these trees helps develop a special soil underneath the trees that traps water around the roots of the trees. So it's a water management strategy that is this result of this coevolution between the birds and the trees, which is super cool.
Very cool.
That's sort of the oops factor in that evolution. I think evolution, you might call it a fairly blunt instrument. I mean, that's the important thing too about evolution, right? Like there's no direction. There's no specific goal in mind for evolution. Evolution just is.
Survival of the fittest.
And so, right, like, so if in this case the tree evolved to the point where it killed all the birds, then that would not be a good evolutionary path. So it really is this mutualistic relationship between these species.